All right, Scott McCoubrey, it's a pleasure to have you on the Single Track Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Finn. Appreciate it.
I was telling a lot of folks before this conversation, these sort of like behind the scenes industry type conversations are my favorite to have on the show. We do a lot of like athlete interviews, state of the sport type stuff, but um, I know you have a storied sales and marketing background. That's sort of my passion as well when I'm not podcasting. So I think we have a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about. Um, where I want to start this conversation is in the, I'll call it the event space of trail running. We can kind of get into it more at length later in the conversation, but for quite a while, you were the race director for the White River 50. You did a lot of innovative things there. You brought the race to, I would say, a level of national competitive prominence for a while. And what I've been thinking a lot about lately is how much turbulence or volatility there is in this area of the sport. It's hard for races to stay competitively relevant for a certain number of years. What used to be golden ticket races, for example, are no longer. What used to be marquee races for other reasons, maybe they don't even exist anymore. Generally, there's just so much change going on. There's such like a fragile balance at any given time. Based on your experience as an RD, what's your like thesis on why it's so hard for any race to maintain that competitive status in our sport?
Well, for one, there's a whole lot more races out there now than when I started working with White River 50, back in '99. And when White River 50 came into being, which was 1993, and Chris Ralph was the race director before I started there. And mainly I was an athlete at the time, which, I was starting to get old already before, before, uh, um, before I started to get into doing a lot more business and less competing in the trail running space. But with White River 50, at the time, it was a very regional sport for us. Okay. And so working with Montreal at the time also allowed me to get out to these different regions and meet the race directors and the key players in Northern California and in the Southeast, in the Northeast, in Colorado.
Yeah.
Um, and at the time, I was just starting to take over White River 50, and we were just starting to discuss the concept of national championship events within our sport and what that would mean and look like. And so through my marketing work with Montreal, I had gotten to know the race directors and kind of the regional players around our sales territory. And so with White River, it was a very pristine environment and course. Um,
Yeah.
in the local runners, there was about 64 people that were participating in '95, the first year that I went and ran White River 50. And I'd grown up there in the White River Valley around Crystal Mountain and Mount Rainier. So I'd been up there since I was 2 years old. Had a cabin up there that could house 30 people, and knew the owner of the local hotel and the local restaurant up there. And so I had this base of connection and this network right around the White River course that allowed me to take the concept of the national championships and really take it to action right away. I could get on the phone and invite
Yeah.
24 athletes and give them a free place to stay. I was working, doing the marketing for Montreal at the time, and we had partnered with Jeannie Wall when they were first coming out. Patagonia was first coming out with their endurance line, and also with Dana Miller, who was working marketing in Ultimate Direction. And so I was able to partner up with those guys and, along with some other work, come up with $10,000 in prize money in the year 2000. And also at that time, um, Bill Rowe was the president of USA Track and Field. And so we had this support from the president of USA Track and Field to really integrate, and get the ball rolling as far as integrating ultra running and trail running into the USA Track and Field umbrella. And so I kind of had all these pieces in place that allowed me to then um, take that event and turn it into a more national event, as well as the connections to bring these other regional runners to come and all show up and stay in my cabin and race against each other. And so that was kind of the platform to kind of take White River from this regional 64 person event, and immediately, the year after I took it over, get the permit in place and have the infrastructure to then bring that event up to 225 runners in no time at all, and had the support of the Forest Service, in the local commerce around Crystal Mountain and whatnot, and had the cabin to invite runners. And the first year we put it on, we had Scott Jurek and Ann Trayson and Tim Tweetmeyer, and we had
Yeah.
Courtney Campbell, and we had people from Colorado, where we had Dave Mackey um, and from the Northeast. And me and Ian Torrance basically just got on the phone and started calling people and saying, hey, we want to invite you out to the race. You get out here, we'll put you up. We got prize money. We're going to compete against each other. And people showed up at the cabin, and Ann Trayson's like, hey, is that David Horton over there? Doesn't he own the Appalachian Trail record? Can you introduce me? And then Courtney Campbell's like, is that Ann Trayson over there? You got to introduce me to Ann Trayson. And so that was the dynamic that first year. It was really taking this regional kind of fragmented sport and kind of brought it all together, because we had the infrastructure, and this pristine, beautiful course that backed it up, which allowed us to continue that going forward. And because I was working in the industry, first at Montrail and then owning Seattle Running Company, I was able to find sponsors to continue coming up with, generally for 10 years, $10,000 in prize money, along with housing 24 athletes and paying for the previous year's national champions to come out. And so that was the platform we were working with in 2000, when we first, kind of introduced the event as a national event. Did that answer the question?
Well, I have a couple follow-ups off that. The first is, you mentioned the $10,000 prize purse. This is in the year 2000. And one of the things that fascinates me is that's still a pretty significant number. Fast forwarding 23 years, there are very few races, at least on the American scene, where you're matching that. Like, Fred and team at Run Rabbit Run do a great job of, I think the winner this year got like 17 grand, but it goes all the way down to 7th place. There's a lot of money at stake. But that $10,000 bar is still significant in 2023. It's fascinating to me that we're not seeing more widespread prize purses, and that number really hasn't been surpassed by races that do offer it. Do you have any ideas why it hasn't really changed, or it hasn't kept pace with inflation?
Yeah, I mean, it took a lot of work, for one. And if I were to throw out $10,000 in prize money a year in advance, I had to come up with that money, right? Yeah. And luckily, the first few years, Jeannie Wall and I had established, the year before White River was national trail running champs. It was the only one in the country, really, at the time. The year before that, Kevin Setness and his group was putting it on at the Ice Age Trail. So that was really the first year, because Kevin was heavily involved in USA Track and Field, and that drew me into it. And with Montrail Patagonia, we went straight to support the first national championship. It came up with a budget with Montrail and Patagonia to provide $5,000 in prize money. And the first year we did it was at the Ice Age race. And then the next year we did it was when I took over White River 50. And I knew that I had that $5,000 there, between Patagonia and Montrail, to at least get us halfway. And then I had to work hard to come up with the rest of it. And it was always a revolving target. Okay. But since we had the store, I had all these employees working for me, which were all the old Montrail runners: Hal Kerner, Scott Jurek, William Emerson, Phil Kochek, Chrissy Mail. They all worked at the store at the same time here. And they were sleeping in my basement, working at the store, training together. So I had this base of support with those guys, and they were my employees. And so I had this amazing pool to work with, as well as these brands that were interested in getting into the trail running world. And I was one of their top accounts with Seattle Running Company. And so they were they were an open audience to these ideas. And so I met the marketing guy from the West Coast for Mercedes in the store, and he was a runner, and he gave us, $3,000, and
Yeah.
we knew the guy down at Washington Mutual, the bank there, and he was a runner, and he gave us, $1,000, and so through the network of the store and the people I'd met from Montreal, I was able to come up. We had a running club. We started Seattle Running Club in conjunction with the events. So we had this nonprofit, which then we built the competitive Northwest scene, because the money we made with our events, we used it to send people to our World 100K champs that were in the club. We had full range of cross country teams we sent to national championships for club cross country, and the events fueled all of that. And so it just kind of all worked together really well. And it wasn't that hard for me to come up with those dollars, just because we did have this network because of the store and with Montreal and the athletes I had in place, that made it less ominous, so to speak. And when Montreal Patagonia stepped aside, La Sportiva jumped right in, and they took over that $5,000 spot. And then I just had to find the other $5,000. So I don't think that's changed. I don't think it's any easier to get sponsorship dollars at an event. And it was not nearly as competitive either. There was just a handful of ultras at the time. And it was.
So you were like a first mover kind of in sort of that like professionalization of the competitive sphere.
Most definitely. And that really started with the Montreal piece of it, because we created this team, and I would go out and run a race like the Mountain Masochist, and I'd meet Eric Clifton there because he beat me. I'd try to invite him to be on the Montreal team, right? And when I first met Luann Park, I had gone out to the Way Too Cool 100 or Way Too Cool 50K, helped Greg Soderlund boil potatoes and gave him prizes to give away. And then I'm running with Luann Park, who's up there with the front guys, because I was not a slouch at the time. And I told her as we were running, I'm like, if you beat me in this race, I'll give you a sponsorship with Montreal, and so she became one of my Montreal athletes. And then a lot of those Montreal runners moved into the Seattle Running Company, came and lived there and trained together, which then attracted other runners. Like Uli Steidl wanted to come do long runs with Scott Jurek and Hal, and Brandon Zabrowski met Chrissy Mail, who was her manager, and Brandon moved to Seattle to work at the store. And pretty soon, you had this training group in this network, and then they all had goals. We're not getting any attention. We want to go to World 100Ks. And so then I talked to Bill Rowe and go to the National Convention for USA Track and Field, and met Nancy Hobbs there, and we created the Mutt Council within USA Track and Field. And then Nikki Kimball and Howard Nippert and I, who were competitive runners and on the Mutt Council, started drawing up selection processes for the World 100K, because we knew the other athletes. And then we started putting together selection standards for national championship events. And so that, along with my connection with the athletes and outreach to the store with the club, and then the events we were putting on, it threw me into the middle of this arena of developing the competitive side of the sport.
Gosh, this might end up being like a 2 or 3 hour conversation, because I have so many follow-ups. And I actually do want to go back to a follow-up on the original question I asked, but because you mentioned something there about like, there were certain moments in your professional life where like people like Scott Jurek and maybe Chrissy Mail were like living in your basement, working at the store. They would say, hey, I want to further my career in this avenue or this avenue. And you would sort of like help them, shepherd them to that spot. I'm curious, like, what inspired you to be moved to go to bat for these athletes to the extent that you did, helping them with their careers? Because I think maybe one of the raps that pro athletes get in our sport is maybe they're a bit passive in sort of their career prospects, and they move slowly, and maybe self-promotion doesn't come as easily. And here you are, like they'll sort of like speak something into the universe, and there you are to provide like sort of like the perfect solution.
And, with Montreal, it wasn't just athlete driven. It was really sales driven. And when I came in and Montreal, which was One Sport at the time, hired me to take on this role, um, they were about $3.2 million a year company. So they're really small. Okay. And they don't have a huge marketing budget. They had really good reps in place that were mainly outdoor sales reps. They were climbing and more hiking boot oriented and had this trail running shoe. And so basically, when I first started this Northwest team, I knew the White River 50 because I grew up at Crystal Mountain. And then a friend of my dad's was Chris Ralph, who was the one putting it on. And so I called up Chris and said, hey, how about if I bring a couple friends and I give you some stuff to give away? And next thing I know, I'm standing up in front of the crowd at the finish line and helping give out awards. And then I'm meeting other athletes. And so I took that out to the other regions where the reps were. And at the time, it was all the information was in Ultra Running Magazine. That's the only place I'd be reading about Brandon Sabrowski and Ian Torrance and where they lived, and then David Horton, and then I learned about the Vermont 100, and I called up the race director and I said, "Hey, I've got a rep in the Northeast, and I want to come out and support your race, and I'll bring some shoes to give away. I'll run the race." We'll do a raffle for your nonprofit. And by the way, I think I heard that Ian Torrance was going to be at your race. Is he signed up? And yeah, he was. And so I go out to Vermont, and I'd already gotten this idea that Ian was a great athlete at the time. He was the winningest ultra runner in the sport at the time. And he was in every result I'd see in Ultra Running Magazine. And so one of my goals, along with getting to know the Vermont 100 and the people putting it on, and then getting the name out there of Montreal, was to meet Ian Torrance and see, along with being a good athlete, what kind of person is Ian? And after the pre-race expo, where I was promoting the brand and talking to people, I went out to the parking area, this big grass field, and I'd seen Ian from afar, but I'm walking past the car, and here's Ian asleep with his head against the window of his car, and I'm thinking, wow, this is an opportunity. So I knock on the window and wake up Ian, and I introduce myself to him, and I'm like, can I buy you some dinner? And by the way, I have this hotel room by myself. If you're sleeping in your car, come sleep in a bed the night before the race. And next thing you know, we're becoming great friends. And I ran about 70 miles of the race with him. He went on to get second place. I went on to blow up and get about 15th place. But after that, I'm like, this is a guy who is an amazing personality. He's driven, he's smart, and so was Scott Jurek, and so are all these other people. And so the ultra running community, by and large, is definitely a lifestyle community. They're into what they're doing.
Soul sport.
Exactly. And a lot of people are driven to be doctors. And Scott Jurek at the time was going to physical therapy school. And he was doing his residency in the Seattle area. And he showed up to the Cle Elum Ridge Run. And the locals of us there thought, which one of us are going to win today? And then this guy just takes off the starting line and leaves us all in the dust. We're all like, oh, he's going to come back to us. We'll catch him. He's a young whippersnapper kind of thing, right? Well, he goes on to set the course record and win the race. And then I start talking to him and getting to know him. And I'm like, this is the type of person that we want to have representing Montreal. This is a guy who's going into physical therapy, who loves the sport, who's super enthusiastic, great personality. And so this is someone I want to sign on as an athlete for Montreal. And that was kind of the thing. One, they had to beat me in the race. And second, they had to be, well respected in the local community. And pretty soon we all became such good friends that when I opened Seattle Running Company, Scott was looking for a place to go, and the store actually allowed him a place to network within the physical therapy world, and it helped launch his work within physical therapy and coaching, as well as helping us launch the store. And then like-minded people kind of gathered together there in Seattle. I think in general, that the group of athletes that we had around the Montrail brand weren't just good runners. They were true ambassadors, at the risk of using a cliche kind of word in the marketing world. But these were people that loved what they were doing. They loved the personality of the brand, and we created this camaraderie. There wasn't anybody else out there marketing to the world at that time, so there wasn't a lot of competition, and so I was able to create this little community around Montrail, and then around Seattle Running Company, that was really authentic. I think that's the main thing, is the authenticness of that group of people at the time.
And I want to come back to the origins of sort of the team marketing play in trail running in a second, but I want to get a little bit of, I want to get some clarity on the original question at the beginning of our conversation, just sort of about how a race like White River 50 might achieve stability in terms of its standing in the community as like a place where all of like the elites will go and do battle, and brands will show up because they're interested in seeking out who the next young gun is that's coming up on the scene. In your case, it looked like you were sort of a hustler, like you were dialing for dollars, you were experimenting with all these innovative just like facets of an event to make it interesting, to make it compelling, the prize purse stuff being one of them. I guess what I really want to get to the bottom of is, like, do you think that in order for a race to stay relevant for a long period of time, it comes down to the individual initiative of the race director, or is it subject to like the whims of all the forces going on in the trail running community?
Like I was saying, originally we had this platform, that I could use to really establish the event. So that gave us a base to work off of. And as far as sustaining it, it really is, I think it has a lot to do with the energy level and the enthusiasm year after year, and the willing to put the work in of the race director, but also having this community around you that is passionate about it, as me and my wife were about the event. We had, I think we probably, our aid station crews were the same for almost 20 full years, except for maybe one or two changes. And then to embrace the rest of the community, like the first year of the Cascade Crest 100-miler, Randy Gerke established the event, and I was just doing an aid station at White River, and he asked if I would come up and do the Olali Meadows aid station up at the Cascade Crest 100-miler the first year, and I cooked pierogies in olive oil because that's what Ben Hyen ate when I was out pacing him at Angeles Crest. And I thought, I got to do these pierogies up there at Olali Meadows, which was no hot food. And there was only like 16 runners. And I told Randy, I'll do that aid station up there, but next year I'm taking over White River 50, and you have to come do an aid station for me. And so, again, this is reaching out to the surrounding community and helping each other as far as the events go. And right up until the last year I did White River, I had a trade with the organizers of Cascade Crest 100. As far as, I do an aid station, I'll do Olali Meadows if you guys do Skookum Flats, and so engaging the rest of the community and then helping support each other, that was a big piece of it as well. But I think a lot of it had to do with really my focus on the event itself and not veering from my vision of it. I mean, so many times I had people saying, oh, you got to add a half marathon. I was even getting pressure from Bill Rowe at USA Track and Field. We need to add a marathon onto this, and you got to do a 50K. And when the numbers were waning for a while. Like we built it up to 225 runners, and it just kind of stayed there for a while. It seemed kind of stagnant. But I just refused to veer from it just being a 50-mile race and really focusing on that distance in those runners and making sure that the experience of the 50-mile race continued to be really good and, in my opinion, hopefully a life-changing experience for each runner, rather than trying to build numbers by adding a 50K or a half marathon. And I feel that was really important, that I maintained that focus. And then I continued.
Keep the main thing the main thing.
Exactly. And then continued to maintain my connections in the industry and in the sport. And then make sure that we're promoting the history of the event. And that way, everybody who helped us out, from doing the finish line timing to doing an aid station, had that same kind of enthusiasm, focus, and spoke highly of the event from all facets of the experience. The other piece was really creating a full weekend experience. And that included a pasta dinner at the Snorting Elk in a pre-race talk with film footage of the years that we actually had it air on Fox Sports Network, which was the first 2 years, 2000, 2001.
Wow.
They had a show called Marathon and Beyond. And also through my connections, I had a friend who grew up ski racing with me up at Crystal Mountain who got into doing adventure film work. And so he could come in, interview Scott Jurek, William Emerson, Dave Terry, Nate McDowell before the race, and he's all the movers and shakers, Cami Semick, and then he would then he filmed the race. And so while they were watching the race unfold, you had this commentary from the people you were watching run, and it was actually a really good production.
I did not know that. That's super cool.
Yeah, and so I used those tools to keep the word, get the word out, give a visual of the course, and then for the whole weekend experience, we had the pasta dinner with, when we got the event up to 325 to 350 runners, that's registered runners. I think the biggest year we had was around 400 runners. We would have the pasta dinner with 200 and some people all together up there. And then you'd have the race. And then we had the barbecue afterwards, which was 400 plus people because you had family and friends. And then everybody staying up at Crystal Mountain, and we would do these informal get-togethers and go up and run on the Pacific Crest Trail. And so it became this full weekend event, which was a big part of the sport at the time. And it was also the allure to doing the marketing for Montreal with the sport, because I go out to Catalina Island and get on the boat with all the same people that are running, have dinner, and take the boat back with all the same people that were running. And so really keeping that diligence of making it a destination event was a big piece of White River, for sure.
Fascinating. Okay. We were talking earlier too about, just what you brought to the sport in terms of this team marketing strategy. And if I understand correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you were the first to do this. There was Carl King. I think he was doing, his electrolyte cap thing around the same time.
Carl was out there.
Carl was there as well. But via Montreal, you introduced this team marketing concept. Ben Hyen, Scott Jurek, you mentioned Luann Park. What was the genesis of this strategy? Like, as you're sitting there at your desk, working with Montreal, thinking about, how you're going to increase brand awareness, get people, grow affinity with the brand, all that kind of stuff. How does this pop into your mind?
Well, so, what I'd done in the Northwest was basically, probably before my generation, which was, there was definitely a competitive aspect of ultra running, but it was a little bit geared more towards the road events. And, Frank Bazanich and these guys were running, these amazing times, but it was 50-mile road kind of thing, right? And yes, there was some trail stuff going on. But when I went to Chuckanut 50K the first year, Doug McCoubrey was putting it on, and there was about, I don't know, 18 of us all giving Doug $10 to go bring soup up to the top of Cleator Road so we could actually race, right? And we wanted to race each other, and before that it was a little bit more of a you against the course as opposed to you against the three other guys that were there that were really running fast: Ferg Hawk, Jim Kirby, Rob Lang, and so we started to kind of get this, and this was happening in all the other regions too, where there were these faster people, and so I created this little bit of a team in the Northwest when it was still the one sport team, and Scott Tucker and these guys saw what we were doing and how it was actually, working as this referral base into REI that had the Vitesse and their sales responding positively. And so I just took that concept and idea and took it out to the other territories that were key for ultra run. And along with myself, in Montreal, Ultimate Direction was just coming into the market too, because Dana Miller, who was the marketing person for Ultimate Direction, he was kind of the consummate winner at Wasatch at the time. And they came out with the first running vest. And, both of us being in the industry, we got to talking at the OR show. And all of a sudden, I had Ultimate Direction stuff to help support the athletes for Montreal. And then to take that a step further, Jeannie Wall saw what we were doing, who was in charge of the endurance clothing line for Patagonia. And she's like, we're introducing this new clothing line, and I'd like to be a part of what you're doing. And all of a sudden, I had the power of Patagonia and the power of Ultimate Direction and Montreal. That tripled my offering to athletes. And Montreal was very small, like I was saying, about 3.2, 3.4 million at the time. And so I didn't have much of a budget to work with. And so teaming up with these other brands as one entity, it allowed me to offer an athlete a little bit more than just a pair of shoes. And also, we came up with an event schedule, and I kind of systematically picked events based around our sales territories and reached out to the race directors. Greg Soderlund was one of the first people I reached out to in Northern Cal, because Northern Cal had this really avid community for trail running at the time. And David Horton was in the Southeast with Mountain Masochist, and they had a real avid group around his stuff. And so I call up David Horton and I'm like, hey, I'm working for this brand called Montreal. I'd like to come out to your race and promote the brand, give away some shoes. And by the way, I want to bring 2 runners that are really fast. Would you give them some free entry into your race? I'm going to bring this guy, Scott Jurek, and this other guy, Kirk Apt, along with me. And then we're going to meet Ian Torrance up in Maryland and come down to your race. And so all of a sudden, the combination of a few good athletes in a key territory where I had a really strong rep and a lot of outdoor stuff happening around the Appalachian Trail. We got to know David Horton, and I met Courtney Campbell in Clifton, and then basically signed those guys on and introduced them to my rep, and then they would introduce them to some of the stores in the territory. And at the time, the sport was so regional that there really wasn't much focus, because none of the other brands out there had seen a benefit in spending money going to these races. But for me, it was a good venue because building relationships and generating enthusiasm is part of my makeup. And so I would go out to these races. And Baz Halley was another one I got to know in Southern Cal. And at the time, he was putting on Shadow of the Giants and the race out on Catalina Island. And I got to know Ben Hyen and Tommy Nielsen and Ann Langstaff and that whole San Diego crowd as well. And then after 2 years of that, I was able to have a really big impact. And Montreal became the brand in the ultra running community, along with Patagonia and Ultimate Direction. Like, we were able to bring the power of the three brands. And it brought a benefit to the races. It helped add to the community and the festivity of the races. So there was this value, but we had a 2-year jump. And all of a sudden, Scott Jurek and I were out at a race, and Topher Gaylord and Dean Karnazes started showing up at some races. And so they were the second ones to, there were other brands, of course,
Right.
that were kind of around. But the next significant brand and faces in that marketing crowd were Topher and Dean. And we got to know those guys really well and became good friends with them as well. And the North Face started bringing some marketing into the sport as well. And, Topher was really good at the same things I was. Like, he surrounded himself with really good athletes and good personalities. And then Nike ACG came in and just started throwing money at a lot of people. And then in 2 years pulled their whole program. So, and decided it wasn't a good venue for them. And so that was the difference in the approach, is you had myself that was really passionate about the sport and trying to support and sustain sales by getting to know people. And Topher had the same approach with the North Face programs at the time. Yeah.
We talked earlier about how, I don't know if I want to call it a standard, but you set a pretty interesting, compelling benchmark with $10,000 in prize money at White River. And in a similar way, maybe with this athlete team at Montreal, you set at that time sort of a standard about what an athlete might receive in terms of compensation. So I think a lot of it was, maybe gear and travel based. My understanding is that Ben Hyen might have been paid a little bit. Maybe Scott Jurek got a little bit of money later on. But it seems to me, and again, I don't know all the facts, it seems to me that for the next, let's call it 15 or so years, there was a relatively small amount of money changing hands between the athletes and the brands. It sort of stayed that way. What's your thesis on why that was the case, especially as, the sport did go through some growth waves in those next 15 years?
Yeah. And, with Montreal, like I was saying, the budget was really small because it was such a small company at the time. And the enthusiasm I brought to the table and a lot of grassroots support for these athletes was kind of the glue, and creating this community that didn't exist there before, and introducing Ian Torrance to Scott Jurek and Hal Kerner at age 19 coming to White River and getting to stay and get to know Ian and Scott. Yeah. And, and for me, I was so into trail running and so passionate about it myself that it was infectious. And we created this community around the brand, which trumped dollars in money. And it was just, those guys were psyched to be making friends and having people to run with. And
they didn't want to make it their living?
Of course, that was something that I think, that people aspired to. But a living for Anton Krupichka and Scott Jurek is a lot different than than the millionaires in the world, right? Those guys were like, for Scott, I would just say, look, if you can get yourself there, I'll pick you up.
But Scott talks about the hardships in his books, right? Like, he talks about like all the credit card debt and stuff like that. Like, there were some tough years for him in the mid 2000s, I think.
For sure. He was working in a running shoe store, Montreal. Like, Ben Hyen he came on as a one sport athlete. And a couple other people did too. But Ben was the first one that we reached out to pay a little money from a marketing perspective, because he had just had this visible aura out there. He had all his tattoos, and he had the fallen mohawk.
Hollywood.
He knew, and because he was pictured in Tattoo magazine, he knew Ozzy Osbourne, invited him to a show, but Ben wasn't making a lot of money either. He was, the fact that he got any money at all from one sport into Montreal, but a lot of it came through my support of him. I would show up, I would go get a hotel or pay for a cabin up in Wrightwood. I was his pacer. And, for the event. So not only did I sponsor him, but I ran 50 miles of the race with him to beat the Tarahumaras and Scott Jurek in his win at Angeles Crest that year. And then supported the community in San Diego. And kind of, and that was important, was this interpersonal piece of it. And with Scott, for instance, and Hal and Chrissy, I was able to provide them with work at the running shoe store. And they were more all about training together. Uli Steidel, Brandon Sabrowski, Hal Kerner. And when I did leave Montreal, I convinced Ian Torrance to come and take my job at Montreal. And it all centered around the store. And I provided this venue where they could live the life of this dirtbag trail running person and still have a job, make connections out there. And I helped facilitate those. For Scott, for instance, I facilitated this sponsorship with Montreal. And at first it was just shoes. And then me bringing him to races and getting him free entries, letting him sleep in my hotel room and paying for his food while he was with me. So that was the extent of getting him on at first. And I would do that with some of the other runners as well. And then it morphed into the friendships and then the community at Seattle Running Company. And not only did I bring him into the Montreal fold, but I'm also the one that made the connection with Brooks that facilitated his bigger sponsorship where he could actually make a living with the Brooks brand when he went from Montreal to Brooks. I was working with their shoe designers on Cascadia at the time, and along with the pivot post and a rounded heel and a flared forefoot, I told them, you got to take this guy Scott Jurek and make him your poster child. And they did. And so I was able to facilitate through the store in my marketing background some of these relationships. I got Ian his job down there at Montreal. When he left, Chrissy was working at the store, and so she moved on to that job down at Montreal. And so, I was able to provide this platform for these guys to make some connections professionally as well.
Yeah. Another question I want to ask on this front is, it revolves around what you believe and maybe what the rest of the outdoor industry believes is the ROI of sponsoring these athletes. Like when you see Scott Jurek year after year after year cross that finish line on the Placer High track, head to toe in XYZ gear, obviously it has to have some sort of influence on fans of the sport, the end consumer, etc. But at least to me, I'm not quite sure how to attribute it to the bottom line. When you thought about making an investment in an athlete, what were you betting the outcome was going to be in terms of the impact on growing the brand?
So my main hope, there's, along with, a person that could beat me in a 50K that was really, well received in their local community. I would look for people who were also working in the industry, working at a shop, that could connect us to, or at least for our reps through this athlete, to meet someone at a store locally. And so I would always try to attribute it back to creating sales within a sales territory, and always including the reps in on meeting these athletes and then bringing them to the events with us, making sure that my Northeast athletes were there at the Vermont 100 miler and meeting Ian Torrance, these types of things. And it was, I was always looking for a way to tie it back to the local store, have a movie night with the old, like I bought all the old black and white Wide World of Sports films on Western States. And when I would go to Western States and get a cabin with 10 athletes, I went to the local store in Truckee. We had a movie night where we showed the old Western States movies, and Scott Jurek was there to talk about shoes and tying it to the store and back to the community as much as I could. And luckily for Montreal, being small, they saw a very steep curve in their sales. And it was all in this trail running category. And so they could see the return on the investment, that we were creating a personality for the brand, and we had really good personalities out there. Brooks found the same thing with Scott Jurek. I'm like, you get the right person here. This is a guy who's not going to just go out and race for you and demand things for you. He'll go to your accounts and do slideshows. And Scott still works with Brooks to this day. And he still goes out and does a book signing tour for Brooks at such and such a store in Washington, D.C. And those were the types of relationships that really, as a marketing person, that I was looking for in the athletes, is somebody who really did take pride in the brands they're working with, and then would want to go out and promote the brand in the sales channel as much as possible. Trail running also was becoming, just at the time, it was becoming the poster child of the running industry. And Brandon Sobrowski was huge, and so was Ben Hyen. Because Brandon had his dreadlocks down to here, and his braided beard, and he's out there speaking Klingon while he's winning the Wasatch 100. He was. You watch all the coverage at UTMB, and everybody forgets that Brandon Sobrowski, and he tied for first the second year. He's an American that did win it, and they never talk about him anymore. It was early on.
He'd be a great "Where Are They Now" episode. It's like him and like Jeff Rose.
Yeah, Brandon's he likes to shoot guns and do archaeology. But yeah, he would be a good one for that for sure. But so yeah, I mean, the tie back is really for one, the personality that these athletes are creating for you. Is it bringing people into your community that's going to help your name get out there? And then what's their investment back into it? And with Scott Jurek and Ben Hyen, it was really amazing how engaged those guys were. And Scott with Brooks, like, he put the Cascadia on the map. And he worked directly with their designers. He helped them through what we had created at Seattle Running Company, a testing lab for footwear, within Brooks. And he had this tie back to Seattle Running Company, which is one of Brooks' better accounts. And then he would go out and advocate for the brand at stores and do slideshows and things like that. So,
you've already talked about him a lot in this episode, but I'd love to spend a bit of time on Scott Jurek. You obviously got to know him really well over the years. You were right there on the scene with him when he was, blowing up the sport and just, having incredible success right in his prime. Behind the scenes, maybe, what did you observe about Scott in his lifestyle, in his training, in his approach to life that might not be evident to listeners and viewers of this show, but really like exemplify like what made him great, like why this wasn't a mistake, like why everything that he did like there was sort of a backstory to it. Like, what did you observe?
Yeah, so I got to know Scott first, when he was about 20 or so, and traveling to events, and his authenticity and commitment to what he chose to do were two things that really stood out. He's just this true blue, authentic person, and very approachable at the same time. And a lot of times, someone who's competing in a sport at that level, they're not that approachable. Although trail running does have a tendency to attract, again, someone who's more into the lifestyle of it all than they are into the fame of it all, right? Especially early on like that. Scott's interests also lied in, in the world of physical therapy, in training, and figuring it all out. When I first met him, pepperoni pizza was his standard food. It was like, oh, I just need a pizza. And as he got more successful and more committed to the sport of ultra running, also along with being committed into the health side of things through his physical therapy and his connections there, he really started looking at training as a holistic type of a thing. It isn't just what you're doing when you're running, what your workout's going to be that day. It's how you breathe every day. Like, he would talk about every time I take in a breath, I think about it, and it's training for my running. Everything I put in my mouth became um, fuel for the workout in the day and then for life. And not only did he buy into the lifestyle of um, running trails in the mountains, but also this health oriented track he was on, which then crossed over into becoming a vegan and fueling himself and to with everything he put in his mouth and how that would translate to his performance in ultra running. And so people look at the concept of being a vegan in ultra running. Scott would put like 2 to 2.5 hours in every morning preparing his food for the day, because you can't just go grab some chips or something willy-nilly. And if you're a vegan and you don't put that amount of commitment into it, you're not going to be healthy. Scott was grinding his own flour and researching how to mix carbs and where to get proteins without meat, and then what is the balance between these things and how your body absorbs it most effectively. And he would literally threw himself into the sport, and it became such a holistic thing that even his posture when he was at the register, he considered that part of his training. And it was really cool to see, because it really opened everybody else's eyes around him, from Hal to Chrissy to Brandon and William, and in how he approached that. And if we even just took a small percentage of what he was talking about and doing, it would benefit us as well. And he was so willing to share it all, too.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So just very committed person, very focused, very authentic. And he didn't veer from his lifestyle either. Rather than, going and working for some bigger company where he can make more money, he decided to write a book about what he'd done, and that's a lot of work and not and a lot of effort. So it was all about just everything really revolving around his lifestyle.
That is so cool. And, you look at the prototypical high level Scott Jurek equivalent in our sport today, and it's sort of a given that they've adopted this quantified self approach to training, and they're very closely examining, excuse me, they're very closely examining the other, 21 to 23 hours of the day. But, 20 years ago, Scott Jurek was doing that as you've described. That's ahead of his time.
Yeah. And, kind of all of us at that, when there became this more competitive dynamic in the sport, nutrition, even on the courses, there was nothing out there. And personally, like, I can remember my second ultra going and running the McDonald Forest 50K, and I knew I had to drink and drink and drink, so I'm drinking and drinking and drinking and running as fast as I can, so I can't really eat anything hardly, and just all that drink is sloshing around in my stomach, right? And I'm like, oh God, I'm gonna throw up. And then I look at the table at this aid station, and there's watermelon and there's salt. And this is before I'd heard of Carl King and Succeed. And I'm like, boy, that salt really sounds good. So I grab a piece of watermelon, scoop out all the salt, swallow it down, run out of the aid station, and about 15 minutes later, I start to feel all that sloshing actually absorb. And I'm like, so then I started looking into it, and I'm like, oh, salt, sodium. And so we were going to like GNC and getting salt tablets. And then we found out about Carl King, Succeed. And so Scott was out there testing all this stuff too. He would, yeah, I'm going to, at this aid station, hand me this thing of olive oil, because I'm going to see what taking in good fat does to my races. And I'm going to try eating a burrito, and so he did a lot of the pioneering and trying out of a lot of the nutritional aspects and for ultra running, for sure.
When you think about the impact that the Seattle environment, the Seattle community had on Scott? How tangible was it? Like, was he getting pretty pushed in training and racing by people like Cal Kerner and Brandon at the time, or was he sort of a lone wolf? Like, what do you remember about that?
No, I mean, that's the thing. Is like it was so fun to go run with Uli and Brandon and Hal, and I was older. You know, I was probably more close to 40 at the time, and I never should have been training with those guys every day. I'm out there running this hugely fast pace for 7 hours with these guys, and then I can't run for 2 days, right? Because it was just so fun, and the camaraderie with Ian Torrance and Hal and Scott and Brandon, and then Chrissy walked into the store. Like my wife and I had just bought an old Foot Zone store, and we had just opened, and Scott and I are standing there. Jurek, he wasn't quite sure where he was going to go to do PT yet because he was just in this transitional phase. So I said, "Come move to Seattle. You can stay in my basement. Your wife can help be a buyer at the store." So we're standing there behind the counter right after we open, and this cute girl walks in, and she's looking around. She goes, "Is John here?" He was the old owner of the store. We're like, "No, John's not here anymore." I said, I took over the store, my wife and I did. And she goes, "Well, I'm just looking for my summer job. I just graduated from the UW and I ran track and field there." And I'm like, I had these ultra running guys working at the store. I'm like, we definitely needed a woman at the store along with my wife. And so we hired Chrissy kind of on the spot, basically. It took us a year to get her out on the trails. And once we finally convinced her she was an ultra runner, she was all in because she was like, first time out, it was just so much fun and the camaraderie out there. And we were doing these Sunday runs that became a real thing where people would want to show up and go run with Scott and me and Uli. And then Chrissy just got sucked right into how much fun it was to go out and train with us all. And so Scott was really into that camaraderie aspect for day in and day out training. And Brandon and Hal and Uli were really able to push him. Uli was always kind of the outsider because Uli Steidl was 212 marathoner, third in Germany, seventh at Stanford Invitational on the track, and he was making a lot of money racing marathons, but he got really into the fun of the trail runs, and so he started doing like 7-hour runs, and it probably didn't serve him that well trying to make the Olympic team for Germany with his marathons. But again, it was just such a fun dynamic group to run with. It was infectious, and that's why we kept having this steady stream of people coming to work at Seattle Running Company because after kind of that group we just talked about, Phil Kochek came and started working for us, and William Emerson, he beat Ian's record for the most wins in a calendar year. Then Brian Morrison came and started working for us, and that was the next generation. Adam Lint, like this was the generation after Scott and Brandon and in those guys, and so we were able to have this kind of constant flow coming into the store.
It makes me wonder because if I look back at like the last 10 years and I think about where the heart of the sport was in the United States, for a time it was in Mill Valley, California, for a time it was in Flagstaff, for a time it was in Boulder, so on and so forth. I feel like you presided over the era where the capital was in Seattle.
Yeah.
What do you see as the main ingredients for making that happen? Because I'm here in Salt Lake City, and there's a part of me that's like, wouldn't it be cool just to be at the right place at the right time? And Salt Lake City sort of captures the same, lightning in a bottle that these other communities caught. Like, what were the ingredients in your case? And are they constant across all these different places? What do you think?
Well, in Seattle, the venue for training for ultra running is like second to none outside of maybe Vancouver, in Portland a little bit. And the reason is that
Mount Si in the winter. You can do Mount Si in the winter.
all year you've got huge hills all around and right out of the water. Even around Seattle Running Company, we were up on Capitol Hill, and it was an 800-foot drop off the backside of Capitol Hill down into the Arboretum and back up. And the Mountains to Sound Greenway was established to connect Snoqualmie Pass all the way into downtown Seattle via trail networks. And there's you could take a bus from Capitol Hill over to Factoria area, which is in Bellevue. And there was a trail there that went up a ravine and hooked into what's called Cougar Mountain. And at Cougar Mountain, there's 38 miles of trails. And I started the Cougar Mountain Trail Running Series, which was designed to introduce road runners to the sport of road to trail running, because it was right there in the Seattle area. We did a 5-miler, 7.5-miler, 10-miler, and a half marathon, May, June, July, and August, in 1 month built up all the way to the half marathon. And we did a training. And so we ended up, really attracting all these, local road runners and cross country folks to come out onto the trail and help develop the sport of trail running through that series that we had. But that connected to Squawk Mountain, which connected to Tiger Mountain, which then connected to Rattlesnake Ridge, and then you were in the Cascades. And so you had this amazingly easy to access trail network, right out the back door. And it was year round. And a lot of people pictured Seattle as this crappy place to come train because of the rain. But it's like 51 degrees and raining, and you're in the woods and you're staying dry. And so it's a really good environment, still is, for anybody who wants to train year round for trail running. And then you combine Montrail was there, REI was there, Seattle Running Company was there, and we had these, at the time, the movers and shakers from the competitive side of the trail running world, which are mostly Montrail athletes, working at Seattle Running Company. And we kind of became this destination stop for trail runners that came to Seattle. Got to go on the Sunday trail run with Seattle Running Company because we'll get to run with Brandon or Hal or like that. And so that was another ingredient. We had this community that attracted people when they came to visit, and it fueled it. For sure, you need a focal point. And Montrail and Seattle Running Company in that community was kind of the focal point. And I took it upon myself to support these runners on a very personal level. Like, I truly wanted to help these guys succeed, both in running and with whatever else they wanted to do. And then I took on the business aspect of it, but it was a true desire to build the sport. So at one point I was putting on 8 events in the Seattle area. And then we started doing coaching programs and trail running camps for high school kids. And myself and Uli and Allison and Chrissy were coaches for a 4-day camp for 5 schools in North Seattle in August for their cross-country programs. And we started bringing kids into it. We started the Bridle Trails Winter Trail Running Festival, which we did a relay. And I would get the high school teams to come out and try to beat Greg Crowther, who was doing the 50K solo. And, these kids would be on a relay team, and they couldn't believe that Greg Crowther was beating their relay team in a 50K by himself, right? And then I was doing programs like for the North Face Challenge. I put on one of the first North Face Challenge races, did a training program for it. And my aid stations were high school cross-country teams who I would give an hourly towards uniforms from Brooks. And then these kids would be out there seeing it all happen. And next thing you know, you got these younger kids showing up to these events. And
Yeah.
And so having those events also, helped to grow that community outside of just the few people that were working at the store. Without that, it definitely mellowed out, dissipated. People kind of went their way. Scott went to Boulder. Hal went to Ashland, and Ian moved there to Ashland also. And then the Skaggs brothers, Eric Skaggs and Jen Shelton, they moved to Ashland because Hal was there. And Ashland became this little thing for a little while.
Ashland too, yeah.
And then I sold the store and moved here, and then didn't tell anybody about here because I'm old now.
Well, I do want to end on that note. When we do finish up this conversation, I want to talk about sort of the Ketchum Sun Valley area. But you know, when I link together all some of the things that you've done, so you know, all the innovations with the White River 50, all the stuff with Montrail, building the capital in Seattle around this trail running community, it does seem like one of your goals in this whole process, linking it all together, was to nationalize the sport, to make it more coherent, to evolve that competitive scene. I'd love for you to talk more about the successes and the failures with those goals. Like, what about the scene, when you examine it today, are you content with? And what do you wish for that hasn't quite developed yet, that was a part of your vision?
Well, you know, there's a lot of events now, like a lot of trail running events out there. And, you know, some of the events that were the stalwarts and the foundation of our sport have kind of gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit. Even White River, you know, James Varner has taken over White River, and he has a marketing company and puts on a bunch of other events for called Rain Shadow Running. And his events are great, but COVID, like the year that he took it over, COVID happened, and there was 2 years that it didn't really happen. And then he didn't have the same network up there at Crystal Mountain per se. And you know, the aspects of the national championships and the full weekend experience got lost in those 2 years. This year, you know, I went up there and James added a 50K, brought his pizza guys up, and now the numbers are starting to go up a little bit again. But not very many of those people that are coming knew the White River of the past. And so with all the events that are out there, and now a younger generation, some of the events like American River 50, and it used to be Sunmart in Texas, and White River and
Ice
Mountain
Age.
Masochist. Some of those events that were stalwarts at the time, there's so many other races around them that they've kind of lost their historical value in the shuffle, so to speak. You know, that said, Western States is more desirable than ever. Hard Rock is more desirable than ever. And that comes to kind of point two of what I see in the current world that wasn't happening back then that is puts me into a little bit of despair, is how hard it is to get into these events. Okay. I mean, like, I put my name into Western States, not even hardly knowing about what it was, other than reading about Tim Tweetmeyer in Outside Magazine. He's another story, because like with one sport, Tim Tweetmeyer was the man, right? And literally I'm dialing directory assistants to get Tim Tweetmeyer's number in Auburn so I can talk to him about trail running shoes. In cold calling for athletes, I call it. But so you have these more marquee events, and the sport has grown so much, and the desire to do these just few events has made it very hard to get into them. And in a way, for myself, I'm like, and I'm not running events these last couple years due to health issues with my knees and a back thing, but I'm getting back into it again a bit. You know, it's for me to make the effort to try to get into Western States. I'm like, forget it. I'm just going to do the I Am Tough or something local here where it's easier to get into. And you know, for sure, we have to have a way to deal with the crowds that are trying to get into these events through lotteries and qualifying races and stuff. But back then, you could send Greg Soderlin a list of the races you've done, and then you qualify for the lottery. And oh, you ran White River 50 and you ran this race. Okay, you're in the lottery. You hardly had to prove it. And then your chances of getting in was like 1 out of 3 back then too. And so I could pretty much plan on going to Western States and being able to run. And now it's there's a lot more that has to go into it through the qualifying races, and then it may take you 4 years to even get your name drawn to get into the lottery. And it used to be, at the time when we were building White River, it was a come one, come all thing, and it was really interesting with White River. We built the numbers up with the national championships and inviting runners to 225 pretty quickly. But then it just stagnated there for about 4 or 5 years. And I didn't have a number of runners in my permit. They would, the race or the special use director in Snoqualmie National Forest, he's known me since I was a little kid. And he's like, Scott, as long as you're doing it right, and you're cleaning up and you're doing everything you need, I'm not going to put any restrictions on your numbers. And so I would just say, okay, no limits. Come on, come to the race. And it was stagnating. And so all these other races had limits, and they were announcing the limits. And so you better sign up quick, because we're going to fill up our 200 runners. And this is as the sport was starting to grow, and there was a lot more attention to getting into the race because of the permits you'd have as a race director. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to stop saying come one, come all, and I'm going to put a 300 person limit on it. And my numbers went from 225 to 300, boom, just like that. Like, it's kind of funny I had to put a limit on it to get everybody to sign up. But it's the evolution of the sport. And so it's not as easy to participate as it used to be in the primary marquee events. And you got to find qualifying races and things like that to get into Hard Rock and UTMB. And so that's another thing I think has changed drastically. It's just the accessibility to the races you want to do.
You know what though, and I hear a lot of people talking about how like you've discussed about how much harder it is to get into Western States, and how much harder it is to get into Hard Rock, and all the hoops you have to jump through to now participate over in Chamonix in the UTMB World Series. To me, this is like one of the greatest gifts that these local indie races could get, because it makes their marketing that much easier. And you look at a race like I'm Tough. I think another race that is very underrated that I think should get more attention is Stanhope up in those mountains. I think Stanhope is it's freaking cool race. There's a 100-miler there now, right? There's a 100-miler there.
Yeah, and I actually had mapped out I ran the 60K the first 2 years that Ben put it on, and I had the 100-mile course mapped out in my head before he even added that 100-mile, because it's equivalent to Hard Rock in beauty and in difficulty. So I agree with you. You're right. There is that benefit of becoming a qualifying race and things like that. For White River, we were actually a point race for UTMB and for a Western States, but then they moved the distance up to 100K minimum, and then White River lost its qualifying standards as a 50-mile race. So in a way, it was a little bit of a, we lost that leader at White River when they bumped the distance up to 100K, because they had to further narrow down the numbers that are trying to get in, because they needed to streamline the races that they were using as qualifiers. And so for some races, yes, like I Am Tough is a qualifying race for UTMB now, and I bet that helped Jeremy and those guys out with their numbers. But like for White River, it is no longer used as a Western States or UTMB qualifying race, just because the distance, that 50-mile distance has become kind of a little bit of a lost distance in that world. And that's why I was really excited that I was able to maintain those numbers and attraction at White River because I just stayed focused on that distance, and it continued to draw the numbers. But a lot of the 50-mile races around the country have gone away.
Is there anything else about the makeup of the sport right now that would have surprised you if we had like traveled back in time to like, let's say 2002, and you were imagining what the sport could look like in 2023? Is there anything about the sport right now that surprises you that you couldn't have predicted?
Well, one is the number of events out there, just in general. The number of events, of course, is indicative of the numbers of participants, and the goal was to grow the sport, of course, and with the idea that business at Montreal would get better and business at Seattle Running Company would get better. So there was definitely a make a living aspect to what we were doing at the time. But I never imagined there would be, I don't know how many
6 races to choose from in a region on a given weekend.
Exactly, and there definitely is a little bit more of a. There was a, and I don't want to come off as down talking anybody, but some of the races with the whole solemn, the whole team thing exploded, which surprised me too. Here we did this team because we didn't have a good budget to work with, and then ACG and North Face and Vasque, and then pretty soon Brooks had a team, and I got attributed with creating a team marketing concept in the world of trail running, which I don't know if I'd go that far with it, but definitely it was a concept that I came up with to create a community. But the team aspect really exploded out there, and I will say that that I go to an event and there was a real fraternal aspect to the team thing, and almost an exclusive kind of thing that started to happen that I was not excited about. Where one athlete was older and the younger athletes were excluding them, they felt left out. Just these kinds of dynamics that are kind of fraternal in nature,
Sure.
Due to the team aspect of things. And I won't talk about brands; that would get too personal. Where I really saw that happening, but it was a young group that were too cool for school, and that really wanted to be the center of the universe, and it became a little bit exclusive instead of inclusive, where our approach was just so inclusive.
Well, I don't mean for this to be a knock on sort of like the inclusivity angle, but I always felt like when we saw this era, even I think it happened with Montreal, it definitely happened with Solomon, where you saw the team balloon from like 15 to like 190 athletes, and there's sort of like that watering down effect of what it means to be a pro athlete. What are your thoughts there?
100%, and that's part of that's part of what I was talking about. Is this, a bigger group that became exclusive as opposed to inclusive. With the Montreal team, my vision was to kind of build it up to about 12 men and 12 women, and then start being able to provide more support for that more core group. And we did tier the support so that we had a national level and a regional level. But it was really the national level runners that we would use as, our marketing platform, as opposed to the regional athletes. And after I opened Seattle Running Company, and Chrissy, Ian came in and he added some runners he wanted to add. And then Chrissy went down there and she added a lot more runners. And then Montreal started actually marketing the fact that they had 95 team members. And I was like, well, that's why you can't respond.
That's a small nation.
Supporting Scott enough to keep him on board, because you're spread so thin that you're leaving yourself open for Brooks to come in, and they only have him now, and they can support him in the way that he needs to make a little bit more of a living at what he's doing this now that he's become, much more visible out there in the world. And so it really made it hard for Montreal to respond to maximizing someone like Scott Jurek, because they had so many runners around him on this team. And then Columbia comes in and takes it over, and then they get a really bad rap because there's 95 people that all of a sudden aren't on a team anymore.
And there was no passion in that company to really grow that trail brand. Am I wrong in saying that?
No, I would say you're not wrong in that. And a lot of it had to do with economy of scale. Scott Tucker, who is the president of Montreal and now is my boss at Vamazi, he also went on to run the Pearl Izumi brand after Montreal. He at first went to work for Columbia to run the Montreal brand. And he was like, yeah, the whole Montreal volume is less than this one rubber boot that Columbia makes,
Yeah,
And
they were focused on Walmart.
And Scott started, he'd say like he'd have interns putting his projects at the bottom of the pile, and he was having trouble getting things done because, again, economy of scale in this bigger company, where Montreal, in the early days, Scott was a fanatic about Nordic skiing and trail running as well. And so we were real like-minded people putting passion and personality into it. And then Columbia, they got rid of all the climbing shoes and the hiking boots. They did have a brief moment of resurgence of commitment to the sport when Topher came in and
Yep.
ran it for a little while. But then he got hired away to go work with Vanity Fair in a bigger role. And I think he's still over at Under Armour now. So there was some passion that came back into it there briefly when it was he was running Montreal and what's the brand? Mountain Hardwear,
Right.
out of Northern Cal there for a brief moment. But yeah, the passion in a bigger brand, just like when Nike came in, when they had ACG, and they put together a team that included Nicky Kimball and William Emerson and a few others. I think Dave Mackey might have been pulled into that original ACG team in about 2004, 3 or 4. And then it didn't pencil out, and so they dropped the team. And that has a tendency to really change the commitment from your athletes and the community around the brand. So that's kind of what happened at Columbia with Montreal. Yeah.
Got a couple miscellaneous questions here before we close up. I really enjoyed the conversation, by the way. All right, so you've helped build a trail brand before. You've built a brick and mortar store with Seattle Run Co. A lot of things in between and after. What has been let's call it the hardest business challenge to date in your career in the outdoor industry, and why? Or what's been one of them that you think would be instructive to this audience who's just kind of fascinated about the behind the scenes stuff?
Let's see. Well, for one, I've ended up jumping around a lot. Like I moved here to Sun Valley. Scott Sports decided to launch a running shoe range, and most of it came out of the triathlon world because they had their triathletes on their time trial bikes that were winning over in Hawaii Ironman, and so they started with more of a road running scenario, and they got into trail a little bit, and I was able then to take what I did at Montreal when they were small and create a team that included Joe Gray, Jody Adams Moore, Sage Canady. I had Ian Sharman, and we had this really killer team. And it was starting to explode the brand. Like I got it up to 93 accounts. And then they changed their focus, moved out of Sun Valley. I lost my role there, and they were desiring to become bigger and better. And then a year later decided they needed me back, and I came back, and the team was gone, the accounts were gone. And then I tried to build it back up again, and then they decided that they wanted to put more money into bike. And so this desire of the professional side of our sport not matching up with the amount of money that the suits wanted to make, so to speak. And so that was a real challenge with the sport of trail running in particular, was really the core authenticity not lining up with the money-making aspects from a professional standpoint. And had Scott Sports just let me do my thing and not in, out, we probably would have been successful if we would have just towed the line and kept with it in the direction we were going. But because they were faltering a little bit on the amount of money that trail running actually could bring in, it made it very challenging for me to keep them engaged as a brand. This is also what happens with the aspect of races and events and raising prize money. Trail running, although it's grown quite a bit, and it may seem like a pretty big sport when we're in it, in the grand scheme of things in the United States, it is a hard industry to make money in still. With Seattle Running Company, at that time, I would go into a lot of running shoe stores, and overall, the percentage of trail running sales was about 2%. 98% was road running shoes. The biggest competition for the trail running shoes was the road running side of it. And so it was really hard to get stores to buy into trail running.
What are those percentages at now? You said 98.2.
Now
so it's 88.12.
So
okay.
It's come up, but that's still
good though.
It's still a small number to work with. It still is not going to be a priority for ASICS. And Nike and Brooks. Although Brooks had some real success with Scott and the Cascadia, they put a little more into the trail running, and they've hired Adam Chase to organize a trail running team for them. They came in at my recommendation into bringing this ambassador, Scott Jurek, along with introducing the Cascadia because we were right there with Brooks. The Cascadia was sitting in the back room at Seattle Running Company, trying to decide how we address Johnny Halberstadt at Boulder Running Company's desire for a stability shoe, in Seattle Running Company's desire for a neutral shoe. How do we address that? And me and Trip Allen, the designer at the time, came up with the pivot post and the rounded heel and the flared forefoot. And he wanted to call it the Cascadia. And then they brought in Scott Jurek, and they saw the benefit of really committing to a personality out there. And they became a part of the community because they had a guy like Scott. And now they've continued that forward with Adam Chase. Whereas at Scott Sports and some of these other brands, we were in, we were out, we were in, we were out, and they didn't stay consistent with it. Nike was in, they were out, they were in again, they were out again, and now they're kind of in again. There's a Nike trail running team going on now again out there in the world. So it's hard to get the big dollars to really commit to the professional life of a trail runner, and a race director too. Again, I think it was atypical at Seattle Running Company. We had this big running club. We had the attention outside of the trail running community in Seattle. We had high school kids with parents, and I had connections to get these people to come in and give us sponsorship for the event. It's hard to come by. And I imagine it's maybe even harder to come by now because there are so many events out there.
It's interesting. I think that general observation you made about the outdoor industry, it definitely checks with my experiences trying to carve out a niche in the podcasting space. Like there's sort of like a dichotomy. Like you can follow your interests, or you can follow what works, and what works tends to be like sort of the service-based how-to type running content. Sometimes they coincide, a lot of times they don't. But it's a fascinating trade-off.
It's really fun working for a brand that's committed to it, though. Like working for Montrail, and then working with Patagonia and with Ultimate Directions. We were all very committed to the sport at the time, and there wasn't this big dollar thing hanging over us. And so we were able to be creative and create a community. And And the brand I'm working with now with Scott Tucker, Vamazi,
Yeah.
they're committed to bringing the new technology to the marketplace. And here we are again with no marketing dollars, with me out there going, "We're here," and but it's going to create an authentic brand, and it's going to create an authentic following. And we're getting accounts like Hal Kerner's store and Pocatello Running Company. We got Rogue Valley Runners. We got Phil Kochek's store at Seven Hills Run Shop. And these are really core shops. And these are the same people I was working with at Montrail that I'm now coming back to. And Phil Kochek and Hal both worked at Seattle Running Company. They both own stores now. I had 5 guys that worked at Seattle Running Company that opened running shoe stores over the years. Jonathan at Ohio Valley Running Company. They're all now Vamazi accounts too. And it feels pretty neat to be in this position and role again now where I can be authentic and core. And Scott Tucker understands the process. He's not going to pull out the rug because we didn't hit X number of sales in the first year of the sport. And so that would be a recommendation, is if you want to work in this industry, find the authentic brands like Black Diamond and these core brands. North Face is pretty core. I mean, they've supported the ultra running community and stuck with it for a long time. Even though they're a big brand out there, I have to give it to them for how consistent they've been. And
I mean, the Flight series is still, it's right there among the best apparel in the sport still.
yeah, the apparel's amazing.
The apparel's amazing.
And Salomon kind of brought this fraternal piece to the team thing, but at the same time, they've stuck with it and they've supported events and whatnot. And so those brands that show good history within the sport you want to be in. If I was going to get into the ski industry, I'd want to work for Black Diamond. If I wanted to get into the downhill ski industry, I'd want to work for Volkel, or these core brands, and where there's consistency in history in the sport, and then you're going to find like-minded people that you get to work with.
It's
you're not going to get rich though.
Yeah,
I'm not rich.
Neither am I. I have no money.
But I live here in Sun Valley, so that's
and we could talk about. Well, we should talk about that in a second. You're wealthy in environment.
Yes.
All right. Last question here for you before we close up. I did solicit one audience question for this interview, and people want to hear your thoughts about the UROY selection process and what it means to the sport. You can take this in any direction you want. What strong feelings do you have here? Why is the audience so curious to get your thoughts on UROY?
Well, I think that the amount of events that are out there again, I'm passionate about White River, for instance, even though James is doing it now and stuff. And the last couple of years we put on White River, Sage Canady got his sponsorship at Scott because his performance at White River.
Anton too, right?
What's that?
Anton as well, right?
Anton, probably. I mean, White River was the visible event, and
Solomon picked up Justin too there.
Justin Hauk and Adam Chase was the Solomon guy at the time, and he knew White River and the history there. And Adam Chase was a one sport athlete, by the way. Back, one of the first guys I signed on with Dave Mackey but so Adam, when he took on the Solomon team, in Justin Hauk only ran slower than Sage Canady, who still holds the course record at White River. That performance was enough for Adam to sign Justin on as a Solomon athlete, and I felt pretty good about that and proud about that. That White River was this event you could look at, and if you won White River, it was a big consideration for being Ultra Runner of the Year because it was national championships. So there's a lot of events out there now that would like to have that recognition and think, well, God, they won my race, they should be up for Ultra Runner of the Year. But it's a little bit more spread out and watered down that way. Back originally when it first came out, with Ultra Running Magazine. It was very statistical, and myself and John Menninger and David Horton, Roy Perung, Kevin Setness. We were, a lot of us, and Nancy Hobbs. We were involved in the organizational aspects within USA Track and Field, and we were event directors, and we all had a vote. Every year we would put our vote in. I'm trying to remember who, I'm spacing his name, that owned Ultra Running Magazine before John Menninger took it over.
Wouldn't have been like Carl, was it?
Carl was a big supporter. Gosh, I should know his name. I'm embarrassed that I'm not remembering it. But he was very much a statistician and was very targeted in who he solicited to. And he would put the list out, and we would all vote on who was going to be the ultra runner of the year. It was also a tighter, smaller number of competitive runners, and so it was no surprise who was ended up making the list and whatnot. Where now there's a lot more people to vote on. There's a lot more events to take into consideration. It's a lot more international in scope now too. That's another big thing that's a change in the race, in our sport. Sending Scott Jurek, Ian Torrance, Dave Terry, and Brandon Sabrowski over to race the Trail Walker 100K, which was a team race over in Hong Kong, was really the first foyer for Americans to go. Like in Montreal, we sent them over there. That was because I knew this Hong Kong race, and so I wanted to send a team over to beat the Gurkha Warriors in the course record. So this there was hardly not a lot of international going on at the time, and now there's a lot. Like you look at the finish, the results at Western States and at Hard Rock, and there's 3 out of top 10 or more from France and Spain, and so that changes the dynamic a little bit. Is this, should we be considering these international races for Ultra Runner of the Year? Where back then it was White River, it was AR50, it was who made the World 100K team, who won national 24-hour champs.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a whole lot of, other standards around it. And now there's just so many more people and so many more influences that it makes it a little harder to come up with an equitable list of people that everybody's going to feel good about. I don't know, is that answer to the state of where we're at? I still think it's cool because it does help bring attention to these runners that have worked so hard.
For sure.
At what they're doing in the sport. But there's just a lot more people's opinions to deal with now than there was back in the late 90s into early 2000s.
Agreed. And I think, part of the overarching looming problem is just like we're still trying to solve the coherence puzzle, and we're trying to figure out, like, does it make sense to have a league? Does it make sense to have a series? Does it make sense to encourage all the best athletes in our sport to really focus on a set racing schedule year in and year out, as opposed to sort of dispersing at races of their choosing and where they're most motivated to be at in terms of, like, scenery and stuff like that? Like, all those questions I feel like are, what do you call it? Like upstream of this problem, I think, in the voting process. So it's fascinating.
It was also a piece of why we wanted to integrate with USA Track and Field, because then, if you won U.S. national championships and you made the World 100K team and you went over there and ran a sub 700K, I was the World 100K coach in 2003, and I had a couple employees on the team, and they're Montreal athletes on the team. And so, I felt very much a part of the process and the ultra, the UROY person of the year. So I always felt pretty good about it because I had a say, and it was people who ran my race and were on the Montreal team and went to the World 100Ks with me that year and that kind of thing. And as the sport grows, there's just a lot more personalities involved and a lot more venues to work with and stuff now. So but
Well, Scott, I can't thank you enough just for all the great insights and being so generous with your time here. I think, listeners, viewers are really going to enjoy this conversation. I'm also jealous of your location. I mean, we didn't even talk about the Ketchum Sun Valley. Or you got the Sawtooths, you got the White Clouds, you got the Pioneers, you got the headwaters of the Salmon River. I don't mean to blow your cover, but like this could also be the next place that a lot of trail runners go, and people that want to, double as ski mountaineers in the winter.
Yeah, because the
Also,
training for the backcountry ski racing is my thing growing up, downhill ski
yeah.
racing. And then I got into trail running, and then combining the two was backcountry skiing. And a whole other world there. And but yeah, the training venue for backcountry skiing, it's a limited window for trail running because there's it was there was ice on the steps this morning
Okay.
up here at 7,000 feet.
And we'll make sure. I think you got a cool thing going on with Vamazi. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes as well. And it sounds like you've got great momentum going on. Building accounts across the U.S. Before we go,
Started. I've got
just
about
started
9 of them right now. But
9
they're
of them. All
all
right,
like these people
but
we've been talking about,
yeah,
Hal and
yep.
Bill and Jonathan, and it's these accounts that tie back to the community we had back at Montreal, and even the job came from Scott Tucker, who was the president of Montreal at the time, and he understood the value of what we did, and so it should be fun. It'll be interesting.
Before we go, do you have any final thoughts, words of wisdom, or last topics you want to cover before we sign off?
I think that what's really cool about the sport of trail running and ultra running is, even though I go to an event, nobody knows who Scott McCoubrey is anymore because I'm 60, right? And I've been hiding out in the mountains for a few years, and a lot of people don't recognize what White River 50 was of the past. There's still this lifestyle element in our sport, and I find it everywhere I go. And it's really cool to go to Ashland and find this core group of trail runners and this camaraderie with the community built around Hal's store and what he's done over the years. And that element, when I go out to the rut, or to other races around the country, it's still there. It's just such a cool community, and people are into it for the lifestyle, and getting out in the mountains. And so what's really neat about it is that this thing that I still want to be a part of still exists, despite how hard it is to get into Western states and who's going to be the UROY of the year. There's still this common bond of this love for the mountains and the trails that runs through our sport, that's always going to hold it together and maintain this like-mindedness of the people that choose to engage in the sport. So I think that's just a really neat thing, that's the same as it was back in the mid 90s and all the way through till now. So I think it's a cool thing that this sport will always have that element going on with it. So
it's like those Talking Heads lyrics, same as it ever was.
Yep, exactly.